Losing my family. Chapter 8. We started home at last, glowing with good feeling from our morning shopping expedition. But when we reached our own street, we saw a crowd milling about, right where our house should have been. Dread filled our hearts because we knew at once. Yes, some instinct takes over at times like that, and you draw on deeper ways of knowing. A rocket hit our house. My mother and I both said it at once. We pushed our way through the crowd, and there it was. Our worst fears had come to pass, our worst nightmare. I noticed the jumble of shattered tree parts littering the yard. That's what I saw first. Next, I just registered a general impression of chaos and ruination everywhere. Then I saw our house reduced to nothing but a pile of rubble and broken glass. And then I saw the bodies. The bystanders who had come to mill and gawk and spread shawls, blankets, whatever they could muster up at such short notice over the bodies of my martyred father, my poor sisters. So I didn't really see them. I saw shapes. There at the scene, I didn't look at my father's face. I was too afraid. I just stood there frozen, feeling dry and drained. My throat felt stuffed and something huge I couldn't cry, or didn't anyway. I just stood there trying to swallow. My mother, however, ripped the scarf from her head and began to tear her hair out by the roots, handfuls of it. She began to tear out her hair and scream. Shocked to my bones, I yelled, "Don't, mother darling, you'll hurt yourself. Don't tear at your hair." But she didn't seem to hear me. She didn't seem to know where she was. Women came swarming around to grab her arms and try to stop her from hurting herself, and she struggled in their grip as if possessed, her eyes blank and her long hair coming out in bunches. My grief at the moment gushed entirely for my mother. I panicked on her behalf. I worried for her. I forgot all about myself, forgot all about crying. There in the presence of my father's corpse and my sister's lifeless bodies, I was conscious only of the terror and panic I felt for my mother. The way she tore her scarf from her head. An Afghan woman should wear a headscarf at all times. No stranger must ever see her hair. And my mother had always been so scrupulous about her modesty. But now she had catapulted beyond all such considerations. She snatched that headscarf off and ripped out her hair. She tore her scalp and drew blood. Then she flung herself upon the ground, and they, the strangers who had come around, pulled us back from the scene by force, murmuring, "Don't look, everything will be fine." They murmured those untrue words, "Everything would be fine. Don't look. God is gracious. Don't look." They led us away. It felt like a dream at the time, all noiseless and slow, and when I look back, it still appears to me that way, as a strange event unfolding in slow motion, behind a pane of thick, dark glass. The screaming, the turmoil, the hustle and bustle, the sense of wildness. It all recedes from me into a dream as I am led away from our devastated house by strangers. They took us to my uncle's house, my mother's brother. He lived fairly close by. Come to think of it, maybe it was my uncle himself who took us there. He seemed like a stranger at the time. Everyone except my mother looked like a stranger that day. Now that I'm talking about it, I wonder what happened to all the cloth we bought in the bazaar that morning. My new clothes. What happened to all that fabric? I've not thought about it until this moment. We must have dropped it there on the street, outside our compound. Someone must have gotten away with it. Well, I hope it gave them satisfaction. We had no further use for it. Who would make new clothes for me now that my father was dead? When we got to my uncle's house, it was full of relatives. Everyone was there waiting for us. Somehow, all of them had already heard what had happened and had gathered. I don't know how the news spread so quickly. I can only suppose that the rocket must have struck our house many hours before our return home. The news had reached everyone who was home to receive it. We didn't hear about it because we were at the bazaar, moving about. No one knew where to find us. My mother fainted at my uncle's house. The sight of her collapsing unleashed my wails at last. But the moment I opened my mouth. Someone gave me a hard slap across the face and said, "Your crying will distress her even more. You stop that crying and control yourself." Most of my relatives stayed close to my mother that night. They clustered around her and held her and tried to comfort her. How she fared, I don't know, because they shut me up in another room. I spent the night alone, a strange night, a night in which I had no thoughts that I can remember and no feelings. I just lay on the ground, curled up, inert, stunned, unable to feel, no different than a stone. Finally, the morning came, but the light seemed no different than darkness. It was like waking up from a nightmare only to find oneself still in a nightmare. And it was the same nightmare. The horror of yesterday merely became the horror of today. Everyone gathered around to solace me. All my girl cousins, but I could not receive their sympathy or cheer. I snapped at them to leave me alone. Poor things had come to console me, and I ungraciously lashed out at them. I told them to forget about me. In those first few days after the catastrophe, I was so dazed, I scarcely registered the existence of the world outside the turmoil of my own heart. I could hardly make out my brothers, my cousins, my uncle's household. The conversation around me sounded like the meaningless buzzing of insects. How much less, then, could I sort out what was going on in the city as a whole and in the history of my country? If you're locked in a noisy room, you can't tell if the rest of the house is quiet or not, if the streets are deserted or filled with rioting mobs. Only in retrospect do I understand that my father's death was just one part of a momentous event that befell Afghanistan in the last week of September 1996. 3 or 4 days after the rockets killed my family, the Mujahideen slipped out of Kabul and retreated north, leaving the capital city to the Taliban. That terrible army of big bearded boys. It was all part of the same cluster of events, the Taliban's final battle for Kabul. I knew of this event only dimly. Certainly I knew nothing of its significance. Others understood more about it. The sense of crisis gripping my uncle's household stemmed from more than my father's martyrdom. With the city in such turmoil, with no one sure what would happen next, no one dared to make suitable arrangements for our loved ones. A group of men hurried to our house, dug them out of the rubble, bore them to the cemetery, and buried them in haste. They told me to stay home. The cemetery was in the city, but you could not drive right up to it. You had to park far away and walk to the gravesite. An arduous walk, people said. They told me that my fused knee and prosthetic leg, I could not possibly make it from the car to my father's grave to see him lowered into the earth. Actually, I could have walked that distance. I proved it later. But no one gave me credit. They thought of me as the poor cripple. I suppose they thought I might slow them down if trouble broke out, and they had to run for it. My mother and brothers went to the cemetery that day, but not me. The service that sanctified the honor the dead were not performed for my beloved father and my cherished sisters. We had to forego the rituals that would have given closure to our grief. We could not have the funeral prayer conducted in the mosque. In other circumstances, those prayers would have drawn hundreds of mourners. So many people knew my father. So many would have wished to pay their last respects to him and to my sweet sisters. But none of these things were done. Everybody was too frightened, too shattered, and with the Taliban coming, the danger to our own lives had suddenly ratcheted up to crisis level. I do remember the day the Taliban actually entered Kabul. My shock and confusion had lifted enough to let the bigger world into my consciousness. And what entered into my awareness that day was nothingness, the eerie silence. No guns went off for once, no bombs sounded, no rockets fell that day. You didn't hear the sound of children playing. You didn't hear cars. You didn't hear dogs or donkeys or chickens, not even the hiss of bicycle tires. If you peeked out your door, you saw no one on the streets. If you looked out from an upper window over your compound walls at the more distant streets, you still saw nothing and no one. The whole city was closed that day. Everybody knew the Taliban were coming, so no one went to work. Even hiding in our compounds, however, we felt the atmosphere of terror. The air somehow felt wild and frightening. Everybody was just waiting and holding their breath. 4 years earlier, when the Mujahideen had entered the city, their armies poured through the bazaars, looting stores, beating bystanders, and clashing with one another. I heard whispers now that people were afraid the Taliban might do the same thing. And indeed, there was some looting, supposedly, but it wasn't the Taliban who did the looting. This time, gangs of lawless Kabul residents went roving through the richer neighborhoods, breaking windows, tearing open doors, and snatching wherever they could snatch. They thought they saw opportunity in that moment between two regimes, but the Taliban armies found them and silenced them. I don't know how. Normal folks, which included most of the people of Kabul, locked themselves in their compounds and waited. For many days, people went out only to shop, and even then, only if they were desperate, if they needed food, for example, or if they needed medicine. Most came back empty-handed because they could not find any open stores. I recall hearing that in our neighborhood, one store did stay open, and that merchant tripled his prices. He made a lot of money until the Taliban had gotten such a firm grip on the city that more shopkeepers dared to open up for business. Shut away in our houses as we were, we did not see any Taliban at first. We only heard them on the radio. They announced themselves. They said, "We are the Taliban and we are here to stay." They broadcast their rules. Women could not leave their compounds without male escorts. If they did go out, even with escorts, they had to wear a chadori, a bag-like veil that covers a woman from head to foot. For some reason, Western reporters always call this type of veil a burqa, but in Afghanistan, it is called a chadori. Also, everyone had to say namaz, the ritual Muslim prayer, at prescribed times. Men were forbidden to trim their beards. And so it went, their rules, on and on. The Taliban were just voices on the radio to us. Then, by and by, we began to see members of the Taliban themselves. A few of them appeared on our streets and in our bazaars. Oh my God, they seemed like wild alien beings, beasts from another world. They wore kohl, which is a black makeup, like mascara, on their eyelids, and they sported huge beards. They all wore big turbans. Gradually, their numbers increased and increased until they were everywhere. Even we women saw them, because now we could go out as long as we wore chadaris. They became a normal part of our landscape, but they still looked frightening. You could tell at a glance which ones were Taliban, even from a distance, and not just because of their beards. For soon all men growing their beards out to avoid flogging. Somehow the Taliban still stood out. Maybe it was the way they wrapped their turbans. Their clothing played a part too. Their shirts were longer than the usual Afghan outfit, and they always wore dark colors. Maybe it was their menacing swagger. In the end, it's hard to pinpoint what made them look so foreign and so alien. They just did. As awful and unnerving as the chaotic regime of Mujahideen had been, at least they seemed like Afghans to us, just brutal, lawless ones. Now we felt like we were in the grip of some strange force unlike anything we had ever seen in our country. Every glimpse of those Taliban men scared us. If we saw one on the street, we immediately wanted to change course, go some other way. The four of us, my mother, my two brothers, and I, stayed with my uncle for 2 weeks. After that, with heavy hearts, we went back to our own house to sort through the rubble and see what was left. We used to have 5 buildings in our compound. 2 were totally destroyed and 1 was badly damaged. We didn't feel safe entering it. 2 buildings remained structurally intact. That blast had blown out all the windows, but the rooms still had ceilings and doors. Our chickens were still alive, clucking about the yard. We decided to move back in and live in the rooms that remained. It had gotten quite cold by this time. However, so we faced the problem of getting through a Kabul winter in rooms unshielded from the elements. My brothers got busy nailing boards over the windows. This made the rooms dark, but we preferred dark to cold. They sifted through the rubble looking for clothes, pots, and other possessions we might salvage. All in all, we were living a primitive life now, but the problems of surviving from one day to the next kept us preoccupied, distracting us somewhat from our losses. Meanwhile, the new rulers were making themselves known to the people of Kabul. Rapidly, we were learning that this was not just another Mujahideen army, but something different. We heard about the floggings they administered to people who had broken their rules, especially to women they caught outdoors without male escorts or women they caught in public dressed, by their standards, immodestly. At least in the days of the Mujahideen, we women had the legal right to go out, go to school, go to work, even if it was sometimes too dangerous to do those things. And women could go out wearing ordinary traditional clothes, along with a headscarf and a neck scarf. And although even in those days some women did wear chadaris, they did so by choice. It was their custom. No one had to. The Mujahideen disapproved of Western dress, and most of them had conservative standards. But within those limits, they allowed women to choose their own styles of dress. The Taliban put an end to choice of any kind. If they saw a woman without a chadori, they beat her with a stick or a rubber hose or the butt of a gun. They didn't go house to house, these Taliban. I'll give them that much. Unlike the Mujahideen, they respected the privacy of the family compound. But if they caught a woman on the streets, she was in trouble. At first, most women could not go out at all because they did not even own chadaris. A few rummaged around in their storerooms and found some old moth-eaten chadari their mother or grandmother had worn 30, 40, or 50 years ago. But most families had thrown their chadaris away. Gradually, however, all of us who did not already own a chadari bought one. Soon, in any public place, you saw chadaris in every color, white as snow, sky blue, lemon-hued, pretty colors. The chadari sellers were going wild with joy. This was their boom time. I rarely left our compound after the Taliban took control of the city, but one time I remember a family in our neighborhood invited us over for dinner. So I put on my chadari. Everyone else's chadaris fit them fine. But on me, because my nose was so flat, the patch of mesh you're supposed to see through pressed right against my face. I had to crumple up some paper and stick it to my nose with paste so that it would hold the chadari far enough away for me to breathe properly and see through the mesh. Even then, as it turned out, I didn't know how to get about in a chadari. I couldn't walk in one very well with my prosthetic, and I didn't know how to see where I was going. That mesh at eye level lets you see only what is straight ahead of you. You cannot really look down at your feet, and you have no peripheral vision. There is a technique to walking without tripping when you wear a chadari. You have to study the path ahead and memorize the landmarks, because as you move forward, the path disappears from view into the blind spot near your feet and on your two sides. If you see a curb coming, for example, you have to use your judgment as you approach it, as well as your memory, to figure out when you are there. And you have to feel for the curb with your toes, the way a blind man uses a cane. Otherwise, you can't know when you come to the curb, and you fall off, or at least you find it hard to step off at the right place. All this must be learned. But when you have two injured legs and one of them is made of plastic, the technique is difficult to master. For this reason, once the Taliban came, I rarely went out. We had the boys do the shopping, or we poked shopping trips with the neighbors so that one group would shop for several compounds. That way, each compound had to go out less often. About a month after my father's death, the Taliban announced that they needed more soldiers for their army. Every family had to give up its sons, they said. They were going to sweep through the city, drafting young men, teenagers, and even boys as young as 10 or 11. No one could hide from them, they warned. Woe to any boy who tried to escape their draft. And woe to any family who refused to open up when the Taliban forces knocked on their doors. By this time, we knew something else about the Taliban. They bore a special hatred towards Hazaras, my ethnic group. When it came to Hazara boys, they might not draft them, but instead might simply execute them. My brothers could not leave the compound for fear of being caught by the Taliban. We did not even have intact walls protecting our privacy, for the rockets had blown our walls down in places. We lived in dread of those bearded bullies suddenly appearing in the gap when our compound gates used to be. And at that, we were no worse off than our neighbors. They had sons too. Most of us in the neighborhood were Hazaras. We were all vulnerable. One evening, therefore, we got together with our neighbors to discuss what we might do. My mother said that if my brothers were drafted into the Taliban's army, she would consider it a fate as bad as death. Those people killed my husband and my daughters, she wept, and now they want my boys to go fight for them. I can't allow it. I would rather tear out my eyes than see my boys serving the people who killed their father. Our neighbors nodded, murmuring agreements, but what to do? We huddled around the fire, blinking back the tears the smoke drew out of us, wringing our hands. The wind hissed through the cracks between the boards. No one spoke. We were all lost in our thoughts. Finally, a neighbor said that the boys had to make a run for it. They had to escape to Pakistan. There was no other way. My mother agreed. You boys are in immediate danger, she told my brothers. You have to go right now. Fair and I don't matter. Our danger is not immediate. We can come later. If we go with you now, we'll only slow you down, because who knows what it might take to get to Pakistan. You know if you'll have to climb mountains, swim rivers, cross deserts. You might have to go without food for days, without water. You boys are young and strong. You can endure such hardships. You go on ahead, and Farah and I will come out when we can, and we'll find you. Then we'll all be together again, somewhere safe, if God wills it. And it's better if all our boys go at the same time, asked the neighbor. All the boys together as a group? That's the way to do this. They can look out for one another. The older ones can protect the younger ones. Let them all head for Pakistan. That's where people go to escape Afghanistan. That's what I've always heard. And we all said this sounded good. We had no idea what the plan actually entailed. Pakistan? It was just a name to us. How far away was it? We didn't know. How did people get there from Kabul? We had no clue. My mother had grown up in a village and spent her life in a compound. She had no sense of the world. I was barely 10 years old. I knew how long it took to fly to Germany, but not how long it took to walk to Pakistan, if walking was indeed the way to get there. The neighbors had a little money to give their boys. My mother still had the gold jewelry she had bought back in the days when my father was alive and making money. We found a friend who had the necessary connections to sell some of that gold in the bazaar. He gave the money to my mother, and she gave it to the boys. Mohammed, who was 16 then, and Gaius, who was about 9. They would try to board a bus for the city of Jalabad, which lay about halfway to the border from there. Who could tell? My mother hugged her sons. I hugged my brothers. We all wept. We held the Quran up to the lintel so that they could pass under it as they went through the door. Then we had them come back and pass a second time under the Quran. And then they passed under the Quran for a third and final time, departing from our home. My older brother was holding my little brother's hand, and they set off with the neighbor boys. We watched them go. A little band of boys headed into the world on their own, with no one to protect them, no one to care for them, except one another. I never saw my brothers again. Well, the weeks and months passed after that. We waited for some word from the boys, but what word could we possibly receive? We had no phone. There were no phone lines from Kabul anymore. The country had no real mail service anymore either. For the most part, only hand-carried letters could get through. What money we had dwindled and dwindled. With my father's death, his tailoring business simply ceased to exist, of course. His apprentices fled for their lives. Without men of their own, we could not go out in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. We depended on our neighbors and relatives for everything. We huddled in our houses, eating what food they brought us when they could. Outside, windows, like my mother, were cropping up in ever greater numbers in the streets to beg. And when the Taliban caught them, they beat them, because they were out without male escorts. We were wondering how the end would come. It had come, it seemed.